Ra sebagai negara berkembang pertama yang menjadi tuan rumah presidensi G20 setelah serah terima dari Italia yang merupakan tuan rumah presidensi G20 tahun 2021. Apa itu G20? G20 atau Group of 20
Penghargaan ilmu pengetahuan.
Ra sebagai
BRIN
negara
Sarwono
berkembang
Award
pertama
ke-20
yang menjadi
dan
tuan
Sarwono
rumah presidensi
Prawiroharjo Memorial
G20
Lecture
setelah serah
ke-22
terima dari
tahun
Italia yang merupakan tuan
2022.
rumah presidensi G20 tahun 2021. Apa itu G20? G20 atau Group of
Penghargaan ilmu pengetahuan. BRIN Sarwono Award ke-20 dan Sarwono Prawiroharjo Memorial Lecture ke-22 tahun 2022.
Profesor Dr. Insinyur Christophora Haniwijaya, Master Agribisnis, selain sebagai seorang dosen di Departemen Ilmu dan Teknologi Pangan, FATETA, tercatat sebagai peneliti di PUI PT Bio Farmaka Tropika dan CFAST, Institut Pertanian Bogor, Indonesia. Beliau saat ini menjabat sebagai Ketua Perhimpunan Penggiat Pangan Fungsional dan Nutrasetikal Indonesia atau P3FNI. Profesor Hani yang menyelesaikan PhD dari Hokkaido University di Jepang pada tahun 1990 ini juga berkiprah sebagai dosen tamu dan penguji eksternal di beberapa universitas dalam maupun luar negeri, yakni diantaranya Pelita Harapan, National University of Singapore, Warsaw University of Life Science, Poznan University of Life Science, Otago University, Hokkaido University atau HU, dan Wisconsin University. Banyak sekali kontribusi ilmiah yang telah beliau berikan, di antaranya lebih dari 100 publikasi jurnal nasional dan internasional, 10 buku, dan beberapa buku bab termasuk dalam buku pegangan kimia pangan yang diterbitkan oleh Springer. Sebanyak 15 paten hasil karya beliau yang telah disetujui, 2 dari paten-paten tersebut sudah dan akan dikomersialkan, yakni permen fungsional dengan nama Cajeput's Candy dan minuman herbal fungsional dengan nama Glucodiab. Atas
Dibacain itunya dulu ya, Pak. Apa namanya? Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Before we start this lecture, I would like to read the rule of this seminar. So participant can access the virtual background and fill the attendance the following link in the chat box. And then during the presentation, participant must turn off the microphone. Participant can ask questions directly to the Q&A session at the end of this event in English, or you can also do it in Indonesian. Question can be asked in the Zoom chat room and YouTube live chat as well, with the format, name, institution, and then the question. Selamat datang kepada para peserta lecture series yang kedua, Experimental Economics, Method and Application in Behavioral and Circular Economic Studies. Peserta dapat mengakses virtual background yang sudah disediakan serta mengisi daftar hadir pada link yang tersedia. Kemudian selama penyampaian materi, peserta diharapkan mematikan atau mute mikrofon. Kemudian peserta dapat mengajukan pertanyaan langsung pada sesi Q&A di akhir acara dalam bahasa Inggris maupun bahasa Indonesia. Nanti akan kami terjemahkan ke bahasa Inggris. Kemudian pertanyaan dapat diajukan pada kolom chat Zoom dan live chat di YouTube dengan format nama, Bapak Ibu, kemudian instansinya, dan pertanyaan yang akan diajukan.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Afi. It's wonderful and precious opportunity in this beautiful morning in our lecture series, Experimental Economics, Methods and Application in Behavior and Circular Economic Studies. The Honorable Dr. Umika Yomudin as the head of Behavioral and Circular Research Center, Dr. Daniel Craig as our lecturer and all participants. First of all, let's say thanks to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala who has given us guidance, happiness, healthy, and mercy, so we can attend and participate in this event without any obstacles. We would like to thank ladies and gentlemen, on this occasion, allow me to introduce you to today's agenda. First is opening and then welcoming speech by Chairman of Research Organization for Government, Economics and Community Welfare, BRIN, and but it will be represented by our head of research center. And then presentation by Dr. Daniel Craig, following with Q&A and then closing. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, the next agenda would be a welcoming speech. Allow us to invite Dr. Umi Yaumuddin from Head of Behavioral and Circular Research Center, BRIN, to deliver the welcoming remarks. Please welcome, that is your.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Dr. Daniel Craig, and also our professor in Research Center for Behavioral and Circular Economics. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you to all attendees join with our lecture series number 2, second lecture series. We would like to thank, and we are so happy having Dr. Daniel Craig from the Horis Limited, Limited. So we learn about the experimental economic and how it can be applied in the behavioral and the circular economics. And we have to have about 1.5 hours. So please enjoy this lecture. And if you have any question, and you can put in the chat box as MC Master of Ceremony have said before. On behalf of our chairman, Organization Research of Governance, Economic and Social Welfare, I would like very honored to having you all here and opening the lecture series, which titled the Experimental Economics, Experimental Enlightenment, Insight into Impact and Policy Focus from the Work Experimental Economics. Maybe I will not to introduce you about the Dr. Daniel Craig, but maybe the moderator will give you the detail of him. But I just say thank you again for Dr. Daniel Craig to share his experience, to share his knowledge, so we can learn more from him how to design the experimental aspect in the applied economics. And then this lecture series is intended, or its purpose is to, as an initial step for us to improve our capacity building, our researcher capacity, to learn more about the up-to-date methodological research in the applied economic actually. And this activity will follow up by the workshop for those of you who are very interested to learn more about the experimental design. And we also has prepared some proposal research, which is we apply the experimental economics design for several topics in economics, such as in the agriculture, in the fisheries, in the behavioral, or in the social welfare also. So please enjoy this lecture, and I hope you, all of you, can gain and take a benefit from this activity. And that's all for me, and wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Kapus, for your delightful speech. Ladies and gentlemen, now we proceed to the lecture series agenda. This presentation will be delivered by Dr. Daniel Craig from an independent research enterprise and guided by Mr. Felix Wisnuhandoyo as the moderator. Before we invite the distinguished speakers and moderator, I will read the moderator's name. So, Mr. Felix Wisnuhandoyo is originally from Jakarta. He finished his Bachelor of Economics from Universitas Gadjah Mada, Yogyakarta, with cum laude in 2011. He previously worked in the Indonesian Economic Development Community of Coordinating Ministry of Economic Affairs from 2011 to 2013. He was then a junior researcher at the Center for Behavioral and Circular Economics, the National Research and Innovation Agency, BRIN, which formerly is known as the Indonesian Institute of Research from 2014. In 2019, he earned his Master of Science in Economics from the Department of Economics at the University of Buffalo, State University of New York. He was an awardee of the USAID Prestasi Scholarship. He has published some books, chapters, journals, and one monograph. His research focused on economic development, microeconomics, and health economics. He is also interested in quantitative and economic analysis more broadly. So now, Mr. Felix and Dr. Grant, time is yours.
Thank you, Bu Atri, for introducing me, and I would like to. I'll be the moderator for this lecture today. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'm grateful to be here as the moderator for the second lecture series that is held by Center for Behavior and Circular Economics, the National Research and Innovation Agency, or we know as known as BRIN. One more thing that we have a great guest lecturer today. He is highly experienced in experimental economics. Let me introduce him, Dr. Daniel Craig. Hi, Dr. Craig. How are you?
Hello. Yes, good. Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, nice to meet you.
You too.
He's primarily a researcher focusing on development and sustainable agriculture. His background is in economic underpins focused on real-world innovation and interventions that can support inclusive and sustainable economic development. Yeah, I would like, before we start our second lecture today, I would like to invite you guys to join in our discussion during the discussion time. Don't hesitate to send us your question by directly asking to Dr. Greg, and the committee will help you to open your mic, and you can send your question on the chat room. Your question in English or in Bahasa Arab. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite the Dr. Greg to give us the lecture for experimental economics. Time and screen is yours, Dr. Greg.
Thank you very much. Selamat pagi, everyone. Great to be here. And before we progress too far, I'd just like to say thanks to APRI for inviting me along. APRI is an ex-PhD student of mine and at the University of Adelaide. So it's great to be collaborating again and meeting again in this space. So thanks, APRI. I'll just go straight into sharing the screen, and then I'll do a brief introduction to Heuris and myself and my team, and then we'll move through into the presentation from there. Here we go. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that. I'll just pop that. There we go. Okay. I can't see the chat. So if there is an urgent question, maybe Apri, if you see an urgent question, would you like to just hold me up and or Felix, either one? Yep. And then just we can answer at that time. So yeah, we're here today. We're talking about experimental economics. I've called it experimental enlightenment because there's a lot of interest in experimental economics, and I think a lot of that is misplaced. Experimental economics has a place in economists' toolbox, but it's not as big as most people think it is. It's extremely useful in a particular set of cases, but there are many cases where there's probably better tools to use. And it's understanding when experimental economics can be useful and then how to progress from that realization through a design process and an application process that yields the most information and the most relevance to policy or program design that you're looking for. So the focus here is kind of on my learning process as I've gone through and done a bunch of experiments and where I've ended up and why that's an important process to go through, as well as some key learnings for you and then where we could go together in the future. So firstly is about Heuris. Heuris is a small consultancy that I started up in the last year and a half or so, almost 2 years actually. I was originally in universities doing teaching, research, the normal thing. I left largely out of frustration with universities that there was not enough impact focus. So there was a strong focus on publishing papers, but there was a real avoidance of going that extra step and making sure that the research had a strong policy linkage, that it directly affected programs, or that it could be directly implemented itself. There was an assumption that papers would generate these impacts, which they don't really. There's very few that do. The majority of journal papers we publish get an average citation of about 1 or 2. So that indicates that we aren't really going to get impact from just doing research. Doing the research is a great evidence basis for us, but we need to take that extra step. And so moving into the private sector, we still do public good research, but we do it in a way where we're directly working with policymakers, we're directly working with programs that have on-ground impact, or we're doing it ourselves. We run a coffee supply chain out of Uganda, and that we're trying to turn into a national coffee program for Uganda. And we're trying to do the same thing, hopefully soon in the next year or two in Indonesia. So that's where Heuris is. There's myself. I've got one of my PhD students, Daniel Hill. He also did his honors with me. So he's currently taking a year off PhD. He'll go back again next year. I do web development too. That's to allow us to have the impact we're targeting. So Jack is our principal developer, and I work with him on a range of programs. And then we've just brought on Millie. And Millie is helping us on the ecology side to integrate the economic and ecology aspects. She's doing environmental economics. She's doing ecology and economics at University of Tasmania. And she'll also help with, we actually operate a ethical cafe here, and she'll be helping out in the cafe because she's a superstar barista as well. And she plays the guitar and sings, apparently. So multi-talented. So that's Eurus. Okay, so straight into experimental economics. And also, just if I'm talking too fast, tell me, because I'll talk faster and faster if you don't pull me up. Okay, I'll get excited. Okay, so experimental economics. This has been around for a really long time, actually. So even when we first had expected utility theory coming in with von Neumann and Morgenstern and Savage, there was experiments happening then to show that they were wrong. Really, really direct experiments that even Leonard Savage himself was proven wrong with his own assumptions. So some really cool stuff. But they really became popular at around the 1970s when Vernon Smith in the United States started to do experiments on irrational exuberance or bubble markets. So these were social experiments, not individual behavior, but group behavior experiments with different institutional structures to try and understand when bubbles happen in markets and when they don't. So these first experiments were really useful. They had direct linkages to policy or macroeconomic policy, because we could start to understand what kind of market structures lead to bubbles, or what kind of social organizations or social beliefs lead to these bubbles. From that time, experimental economics has exploded. And it really ran right through until the early 2000s, early 2010s, when there was a huge rush on experimental economics. Everyone wanted to be a part of it, including me. I got super excited by the idea of experimental economics as this awesome tool that would allow economics to move out of conjecture and into becoming a real science. Has it really achieved that? That period was really a period of irrational exuberance around experimental economics itself. The market has pulled back, it has corrected, and experimental economics is now actually, it's very hard to publish in experimental economics, to put it simply. If you want to be able to do an experimental economics study and you want to publish it in a good journal, you need something that's super special, or you need to be moving into the current area of irrational exuberance around randomized controlled trials, which most of them are not very useful. There are some that are very useful. So what I'm trying to go through here is point out, when are experimental economics methods useful, and how can we pull them from just being a publication perspective to really informing policy and program development? And that's where I'm driving, because if you can do that, it doesn't matter if your experiment isn't building new theory, you should be able to publish it because you're having big impact. And so there's a shortcut to publication and research kudos here, and that's to make sure that your experiments have real world applicability in their results. If you can get that, you're on a winner on a policy impact basis, and you're more likely to be able to communicate the impact of that for research outcomes. So that's going to be my main message throughout this. You'll see that some of the stuff that I've worked on is very technical, but there was always a strong linkage straight back to the real world. Some of it's been very simple, with direct linkages through to our supply chain mechanisms. Sorry about the dogs. My partner's just arrived home. Okay, so that's the general thing. So why experiments? What do they do? Basically, experiments allow very specific testing of individual and social decision making. The original aspects of experiments were around testing theory and calibrating and testing general policy innovations. I'll put that in a small box because I think that's now, and for us as applied economists and applied policymakers, that's of less interest. It can be of interest. We have one example in this case that we'll go through on that. But where the real interest is in this bigger space. It's saying, okay, we've got a policy idea. Will it work? What are the cases in when that policy idea will work? What about supply chain programs? Can we make them work better for equality? Can we make them more efficient and improve the quality assurance in those programs? Are there savings behaviors that are malleable to allow us to change policies or procurement programs to target women better in the household, to target investment in education and housing better? These kinds of questions are where the real meat of experimental economics lies. there's very few questions that are going to yield theoretically interesting insights and policy relevant insights at the same time. Economics theory has moved so far beyond the real world of policy that frontier of economic theory isn't really useful to us. There's a whole bunch of work before that with pragmatic changes and thinking of what the existing theory says and modifying it slightly, where we can get some really big policy wins and program wins. And that's where I think the key focus needs to be. So you'll notice in each of these slides, I'll talk around it. You can read the slide. I'm not going to tell you the dot points, and I'll just kind of wing it as I go through, okay? So on this, I'm going to take you on a short tour of the experiments I've run. It won't be all of them, but it'll be some of the key ones. Not all of them are published. I'll outline the theoretical development underpinning them. That's really important. If you don't have a solid theory or a solid idea of what the decision problem that you're trying to model is, you can't move forward. You can move forward, but you won't end up with much unless you're really, really, really lucky. You need to start off with a solid understanding of what the decision problem is. Then I'll describe the approach and technology and methods used, the results, point out some good and bad aspects, and then we'll do that for each of the experiments I'm going through. And then at the end, I'll talk about some extra work that we're currently doing at the moment, as well as what we're targeting. And then maybe just some ideas on how we could work together in the future. Right, so the first one I'll talk about is a set of experiments in India. This is the first set of experiments out of my PhD when I started at Waikato University in New Zealand. And what it was a decision theory set of experiments applied in the real world in India with farmers in India, livestock farmers, looking to consider whether existing common pool grazing resources were being used efficiently and in a way that was equitable, so pro-pool. Basically, no, they weren't, is the answer, just to tell the story right now. But how do we get there? We'll go through it. So the framing of this one came about, from my PhD, you'll see a bit later, I had quite a large interest in non-standard decision theories. So these are theories that take expected utility way beyond the additive single period framework that they're generally applied in. In this particular case, it was a multi-attribute utility theory that allowed for correlation between different aspects. This is normally assumed to be zero, the correlation, because everything's fungible and we can separate, but it's not actually the case behaviorally. Even in trade settings, when we think of green box subsidies, those are highly likely to be affecting production output through joint risk outcomes. So this kind of approach has big relevance to macro policies as well as to the micro setting that they're applied to here. But the theory is not so easy. So we'll quickly go through that. You can see on the right here, that's the multi-attribute utility function. It's not overly nice looking. It's complex. It has 3 parameters, well, more than 3 parameters because you've got the utility function too, the partial utility function. So there's a whole bunch going on here. What it does allow you to do is start to untie decisions around a single attribute of utility and the joint outcomes of all of the attributes of utility. Now, we apply this to livestock farms considering 2 types of livestock feed. These common pool grazing resources typically generated either a pasture or both. They generated pasture outputs, so grass, and tree fodder outputs, usually leguminous tree fodder outputs, so high protein, but not overly digestible by cows, very digestible by small livestock. The pasture, obviously digestible by cows. Now, which do you think the wealthy people in the community preferred? Well, they had cows, large livestock, so they preferred grass. The poor producers tended to have small numbers of small livestock, sheep and goats, so they wanted a stronger percentage of leguminous fodder in there. Now, second question is, who had the political power in these communities? The wealthier producers. So there was a tendency for these common pool grazing resources to use community financial resources to plant more pasture over planting more fodder. So we wanted to start to show that this was not exactly a pro-poor policy. It wasn't equitable. And we thought, well, how do we show it? I'd done a lot of work on these bivariate utility functions, but why not use that? So we did. And that was pretty much the genesis of it. Mapped out the decision function, I think this is on the next one. Yep. Okay. So the key thing here is if we can estimate this, we can compare the value weights for each type of fodder, the tree versus pasture, against the market prices. We had a conjecture that there was cash constraints, which means that these value shares would differ if there was a market failure in the fodder market. And so that was the key identification thing. And then we could also consider risk preferences and correlation inversion. Now, how to estimate these three things? You can't just run one little question or a few little questions and answer them. But you can run a set of multiple price lists. So there've been work in these bivariate utility functions had actually been applied in the impatience literature to talk about correlation between periods and time. So what I did was I borrowed that and pulled it into the context of correlation between different fodder attributes. It's exactly the same decision problem. It's just theoretically, it's exactly the same. Just doesn't involve different time periods. It's all at once. And so we set up 3 multiple price lists, which had different focuses. One was just on the value shares between fodder and tree fodder and grass fodder. Second one was on partial risk aversion for those 2 attributes. And the third one was on correlation aversion between, so if they both move together in terms of risks, people will avoid that, whereas if they're hedging, people tend to prefer that. So we had to run these 3 experiments. Now, one further problem is that, okay, if you run a multiple price list, they're typically done with monetary rewards, but we want to understand grass and tree fodder rewards. So most people, what they do is they frame the multiple price list, use pictures, but they reward the farmers in money. This is not incentive compatible. They are different problems. If the farmers know they're just getting money, money is totally fungible. It can be moved from one fodder to the other. You're not actually testing what you want to test. So the extra novelty we did on this one was that we paid farmers in grass and tree fodder in exactly the amount, the kilograms that we outlined in our experiment. So that now we had full incentive compatibility. It means that whatever option you selected in here was what you're going to get paid. So we thought that was pretty cool, and it is pretty cool, but very few people do that. So now, okay, each multiple price list had 10 choices. There's 3 of them. There's 30 choices to pay, okay? Of course, we don't pay each one. To solve this problem, we apply the random lottery incentive mechanism. Basically, you select one, once they go through the question set, you select one of the lists at random, then one of the choices at random, and then you flip a coin to work out which option, which alternative out of that choice is going to be chosen. So that's called a random lottery incentive mechanism. It basically means each choice has equal weight as an incentive. Right? So this is just going through some of the pragmatics of design. These are the kinds of things you need to know about and think about in designing an experiment. And so you can see a process from problem, theory, application of the theory through a method, and then pragmatic application of the experiment so that we make sure we have incentive compatibility and it's feasible. That's that process up to now. Okay, so what were the outcomes? We did find that these results they supported our conjecture. Basically, there did appear to be relatively severe differences in the value shares for fodder, tree fodder versus grass fodder, for poor versus rich people. So that was very indicative of both that small farmers preferred tree fodder and that there was a market failure. Right. So we're able to point that out. There's a few other things around risk and correlation aversion that were also pretty interesting, but it pointed pretty clearly to a need for these common pools, so communally owned resources, to act in a more equitable way. What were the issues? Well, we had a low sample size. We didn't really have the resources to spend a lot of time in the field in India. So we only had about 100 responses. That can work in some field settings, but it's difficult, particularly when you're trying to run something such as multi-attribute utility that a lot of economists just simply don't like. I'm not sure why they don't like it, but they just don't like it. We didn't have the resources and planning to procure, to do this at the level we should have been able to do it at. And I think if we'd done that, we would have got a much better paper, particularly if we had associated with a general survey, which we did. But then the general survey went out to a completely different group of people. So this is one of the fun things of working in India. That was a learning. We didn't have the resources and planning to procure the feed at the exact time. So that's a small issue. It leads to there's a slight trust issue potentially here. The farmers might be going, well, are they really going to pay us? We don't think that really affected the decisions. But, you know, if we're going to do it again, we'd try and make sure that the grass and the tree fodder was there right then. And that would be a very, very strong, there'd be a lot of a stronger incentive around that because they could see it and then they could feel it and know it's there. And a key thing on the publication side, it's probably too theoretical for a field study. I think in retrospect, so down the bottom here, I would probably these days, I've got an idea around using revealed preference choice experiments. So that's a particular idea I've been developing on how to do it. This would be a case where that would be highly applicable. And I think you'd get a good publication. You also wouldn't need to rely on multi-attribute utility theory. It'd just be a straight choice in a choice experiment. So was it a good experiment? Yeah, I think the development process went very well. We had a very clear theory linked back to pragmatics. We were limited by resourcing, and you know, it was relatively early in my career. I think we could have done things a little bit better, but actually overall, this one turned out really, really well. So when you've got a good idea, work through it. The other thing in retrospect is, I mean, I didn't have this at the time, is use your network. If we were able to review this experiment a bit more, I think would have got a little bit more support for it, and we could have refined the design a little bit more. So that's the key learnings there. The second one I'm presenting is actually one of my first experiments. This was from my PhD. And so this was around using experiments to understand why grazing land managers, so people operating large livestock farms in rural Australia in the north, the rangelands we call it, why they were making decisions that led to land degradation, right? Because we had a very strong feeling that this land degradation was also linked to profit loss in the long run. So they're taking profits now. The land was degrading, but that reduced their potential to make profits in the future. So we thought there was synergies here. And the idea here was to say, well, we don't think this is because they're bad managers. We actually think it's because the decision problem is extremely complex. And this came at the time I was working on bioeconomic work, where I was showing that basically these grazing systems are predator-prey relationships. They've got two sets of dynamic populations working on top of a natural asset, soil health, that fed into it. And each of them had a different speed of movement. And the grazing land manager was choosing the harvest rate of the livestock, which were harvesting pasture themselves, and the pasture itself was feeding back into the soil. So this is a really, really complex system. So I thought, well, let's set this up as an experiment, understand if that complexity is leading to a short-sightedness. It's leading to people going, they can't manage it. The decision tree, which you can see on the picture here, is growing too big and it becomes infeasible. Okay, so I set up this experiment, and the theory was around dynamic decision making. The problem was that basically, are land managers facing an overly complex decision problem that leads to land degradation? It's the first bit. Second bit is, can we characterize that decision making in that dynamic decision problem? And the third bit it was something that I think is the key novelty, is that is there simple heuristics in these systems that can actually solve these problems almost optimally, if not optimally? Right, so we're moving through the whole decision problem, trying to come at this problem. Instead of saying grazing farmers are bad, we're trying to say, well, why aren't they optimizing their systems, and can we find better ways to do that? This was how we did it. Was we set up 3 framed field experiments. So a framed field experiment is basically you're paying them money, but you're framing it. So before I said about paying them fodder, etc. Well, this case we couldn't do that because we can't pay them in livestock and pasture dynamics. So we had to pay them in cash, but we framed it so it felt like a real world decision problem to them. We had 3 of them. The static gave us the learning and allowed us to teach them about the experiment and gave us risk preferences. The first dynamic gave us this impatience, this myopia estimate. And the third one, I included ambiguity to check if uncertainty moderated the complexity, made them move back from taking risks. And so, because that would be more realistic. And we undertook the experiments with land managers themselves, usually at their homes and farms. So this involved me driving around and living in a van for several months. Reward, quite large, $250 multiplied by a performance score of at most 1. Reason it's large is because farmers are time poor and they value their time very, very highly, particularly for survey activities. So we had moderately good resourcing for this. Thing is, though, I only had 50 respondents, so even lower numbers, but we got this published twice. We could probably even get another one out of it if I had the time. You'll see that again, there's a pretty horrible decision function on the right here. So this is again speaking to the need for theory in a lot of these things. They're not all theory. The next ones we go through a bit lighter on the theory. But basically the top equation there is a Bellman equation. It's the solution to a dynamic optimization problem in standard classical economics. And in this case, we could apply it. The cool thing about this is that because these experiments all happened at once, this standard theory involving a discount parameter, the discount parameter is actually speaking to myopia, not impatience, because there's no time problem here. It's just a dynamic optimization problem at a period in time. And so we're able to translate that impatience factor into a myopia, a short-sightedness. Now, it turns out the English economists pretty much forever have viewed discounting as irrational impatience. So this is a really nice linkage to old theory. And it actually points to the difference between the English economists and the ones in Chicago in the US in their fights around optimal climate change pathways and policies, where Nordhaus is promoting a market-based interest rate and Stern is promoting a very, 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 very low discount rate. This suggests Stern is correct, basically, which means act on climate faster. Anyways, so that's the main thing. This involved a lot of custom work, custom programming of the experiments and custom estimation routines, which were pretty crazy. So this is not something that most people would do. There's a decision tree. Program these in the VBA. At the time, existing experimental programs were totally unsuitable. And it's based on an existing ABCD land condition framework that was really well understood by land producers, which means it was very easy to get them moving through this. They understood how to aim for a land condition. That land condition supported different profit rates. And if they chose a high stocking rate, got a low rainfall, their land condition would decrease. That's the kind of dynamics. They chose a low stocking rate and there was high rainfall, their land condition would increase. And so this is a 20-period choice experiment. And the idea is that you invest early in your land condition, so low stocking rate, first 5 to 7 to 8 choices. And then once you get up to a point, you can start to take the profits. And that's actually the heuristic I developed to test whether heuristics could beat the rational decision function. So that's what we did. We had a very small number of responses, 50, but as I mentioned, we got this published because it had some really strong results. This is a general publication. This is just looking at general patterns. There is a very strong indication of myopia. Uncertainty aversion doesn't appear to reduce myopia, which is good. The bottom diagrams there, what they show is that this heuristic I just described, so I just made it up, thinking that it's essentially a bang-bang heuristic, which means save, spend later when you've got the income to spend. But that line going up through the graph, if the dots are to the right of that line, it means the dots are doing worse than my heuristic. And so my simple heuristic simulated against the conditions that each participant got performed better than all participants. So what does this mean? This means that yes, complexity is a major problem in our experimental setting, and that a simple heuristic can do better, right? How does this translate to the real world? Well, apparently it translates to the real world. First of all, reward scores are highly correlated with myopia and salience effects. Okay, that's good. That means that our experiment is pretty much spot on. This goes further. I went through and did a spatial remote sensing routine and measured the ground condition, the ground cover, which is a proxy for land condition in these areas, on each property over a period of time. What we found was that these experimentally estimated parameters, myopia and salience, are highly predictive of land condition on these properties too. Right? So that's pretty much, this is a very, very successful experiment, theoretically tied to a real world decision problem with a linkage back to how you could actually pull a lever to improve things. And we found all of it to work really well. So this one was a great outcome. It turns out this is actually one of my lowest cited papers, but it's probably my favorite paper. Figures. Okay, so where has this gone since then? So my supervisor at the time has asked me to program new things up. So I developed one for sugar farmers that was basically built on Android tablets. So I programmed that into Android tablets, did that in workshops, ended up being a great tool to train sugar farmers about the importance of looking forward in time and understanding dynamic optimization. It also showed that farmers were actually better than their advisors in decision-making in these games. And I've also programmed another version of the grazing experiment for John to go use in his own workshops as a training tool. And so that was hosted online for a while. I basically programmed that in O-Tree and put it on my own server. So what that's speaking to is that there's some hard skills you need to learn here too. There's not just hard theory and then do the experiment and estimate it. There's all the soft stuff in between around getting this to the field and doing it well. And then there's these skills around, okay, so if you think of experiment, if you only have experimental economics, you can call that a hammer. This is what a lot of experimental economists have. They try and hit everything because everything looks like a nail, right? It's the same thing if you're only using Z-tree or O-tree, you're really limiting yourself to a specific type of experiment. So being able to think, okay, I have this idea, how do I implement it? Instead of going, I have O-tree or Z-tree, which are the programming languages most used in experimental economics, I'm going to fit my experiment into that program. Not a good move. Bring somebody else on who can help you create this or learn the programming yourself and make sure that you're open to new pathways to achieve the best possible outcome. Okay, third one. This is around conservation auctions, which I've recently talked around with Pak Talim and Eridoto and some others on some work in Indonesia. And it's actually a policy that we may be simulating for the highlands around Bandung, around whether we can actually induce improved land management in those areas. So what this one was, these conservation auctions, basically they're typically government-run auction process where they're trying to procure better land management outcomes on usually agricultural landscapes. So they say, we're going to spend $1 million and you farmers submit bids where we'll pay you and you will do something that improves land condition, whether it's putting everything under permanent forestry or whatever. And then you set up a metric, you estimate who offers the best bang for buck, and you fund those bids until you hit your $1 million. It's pretty simple. Now, there's a few issues with this. First of all, they're not dynamically, their incentive structure is kind of perverse. It incentivizes, and a lot of conservation auction people don't agree with me, but it's a very simple mathematical argument that these auctions, if you had a unit price auction, there wouldn't be these incentives. But because they're trying to capture the rents of each person by paying them their bid value, what that does is that leads to incentives to increase your bid value, particularly if you think you're a competitive bidder, which means the government's not getting as good a value as it should. And it's also incentivizing bid shading or hiding how bad your bid is to the government. Sounds pretty normal for government, right? Now, so despite that theoretical rhetoric, they're not as efficient as they're made out to be, but maybe we can use nudges to make them really efficient. And so the idea here was that there was this, at the time, there's a few years ago, this work on anticipated regrets. So anticipated regret is a different form of economic decision making. It's not an expected utility theory, it's a different theory. And it's a theory that says, well, people make decisions by minimizing future regrets around those decisions. You can actually map this through to expected utility in some cases, but it differs in that if there's a major loss-making scenario in the future, somebody that's minimizing anticipated regrets will really try to avoid that scenario rather than taking the expected utility and maximizing it. So what we thought is, well, what if we frame the conservation auctions as presenting, when they go to make their bid, they say, remember, if you bid this high, you might actually lose. And so see if that induced them to lower that bid. We did this in a lab because that was the best setting. We needed, first of all, conservation auctions are very expensive, extremely expensive, and you get very few bidders. So it's almost impossible to test this in a real world setting. but we can induce the setting in a lab relatively easily. So that's what we did this time. This is the lab experiment conducted at the University of Adelaide. Basically 12 auction rounds, along with a couple of risk and ambiguity preference measures that we developed off some other ones, but they're a bit different and a bit better. This is actually a really simple theoretical setup, right? So we can actually go through and write out the anticipated regret utility function, but we don't need to because we're not estimating that utility function. All we're doing is this is essentially a randomized control trial in a lab setting. We're giving them a nudge and seeing if that reduces increases the bid frequency or reduces the bid value. And that's it. Simple as that. We have, obviously, lab experiments, you need to reward them. So here, I prefer to pay them more if possible. We calibrated it to about $35 per hour on average. And it was based on randomly selected auction games. That was their payment. And this was based in O-Tree. So program this in O-Tree, put it on the server, and then would run it from the lab relatively easily. Mostly, okay, so this experiment, it did work pretty well. Again, core issue, we didn't have enough resourcing to run enough of these experiments, which means we didn't test it completely. Bad. And my colleagues weren't exactly helpful. It was me running this whole thing, writing the whole paper, doing everything. So in the end, I just gave up, actually. So that's still a working paper, and it's sitting there until my colleagues decide to work on it as well. But basically, this is potentially a very good experiment. It is on hold because we don't have the money to continue. And as I said, we didn't pilot it enough. If we'd piloted it enough, in our anticipated regret framing, we did both a neutral and a negative framing. So if you don't lower your bid, you're going to lose, negative framing. That's the one we really wanted. But we also had, I think it was a positive framing, which is, you know, you might want to increase your bid because what if you win and you could have had more? No, it was a neutral. It had both of them. And then what we actually wanted was only the negative. Yeah, sorry. So the neutral one, very little effect, as you'd expect in retrospect, right? The negative one, we only ran 2 experimental labs with that. That was actually showing really good effects, but then we ran out of resourcing. And actually the other thing we ran out of was respondents. At this time, the lab recruits were running really low at the University of Adelaide. And so it was a huge struggle to find people to come in. So there's multiple issues on this one. So where does this one sit? What's the key learning? I think on this one, the key learning on this one is that we should have passed this by some of my colleagues outside of our small group of co-authors first. Just to do a quick check, I think they would have picked up on the negative and neutral framing. We should have run a pilot and done some checks before we really ran it out. And then we're hit by a few things. The resourcing problem and the participant list was very, very low. So those were 2 things we couldn't really avoid. But overall, those are still, that's a set of experiments that would be relatively easy to finish off, and I think would result in some really good outcomes and a pretty interesting paper. Yeah, the other thing this one shows is that even though you're building on theory, you don't need to estimate a theoretical model. If you can change your experiment to be basically a randomized controlled trial, you can avoid that whole theoretical development. You just need to make sure that you're motivating it from a perspective of the real world, firstly, and secondly, from an economic conceptual basis. So that brings me to I think this is the last one I'm presenting at the moment, but I'll go over some of the other ones that we're working on. This one was actually done with 2 interventional psychologists. And I can't recommend highly enough working with interventional psychologists as a behavioral economist. They just have such a clear idea of decision making. It's astounding. And the reviewers in psychology are amazing. They are far better than in economics from my experience. So this is a great experience for me. The main one on this, Nicole, the main colleague of mine on this, Nicole Mead, is a friend of mine that we worked on some experiments around savings decisions in Laos together. And she told me about this study. I said, well, she said, can I do this in Uganda with you? I said, sure, let's do it in Uganda. Because we were working our coffee supply chain stuff there, and I was interested in savings behaviors. Anyways, what this picture shows is positive illusion. It's an old man looking at himself in the mirror, and he's seeing a young, good-looking man, even though he's not young and good-looking. Positive illusion. Okay. And next one's a cat that thinks it's a lion. Obviously, that one's much more obvious. Okay, so what is the problem? Persistent low saving in households, both developed countries and developing countries. This leads to financial stress, poor performance of poverty interventions. Okay, so that's our real world hit. Are these due to institutional factors, personal biases, or whatever? Well, we hypothesized that a large portion of these were actually due to positive self-delusion. The idea that I'm a better saver than I really am. And so there's your theoretical linkage. Now, this theory is actually, it's a psychological theory. It is in economics, but nowhere near to the extent that it's in psychology. And the economists have actually pulled it from psychology. So that's our theoretical basis. If you read this paper, there's actually a huge amount of development of this, largely by Nicole and Emily. But the development of the theory in psychology is much like that last paper, is that it's outlining in a descriptive sense, defining the key aspects of it and testing those. So you don't need to go into that mathematical aspect of it. How do we do it? This is essentially a field RCT. We first of all assessed expenditure patterns for a large range of expenditure items. We filtered that down to 5 key ones that pretty much everyone did at least once a year. Now we had their frequencies, and there was probably, we could have done a Likert scale with those frequencies and had the mean in the middle. What we did, it was actually slid that Likert scale to the left, and we made it so that everyone rated highly, extremely high amounts of expenditure on these things, which made them feel like they're spending too much. We also colored it like green to red and trying to get most people to end on red. So this made them, those that were treated, feel like they were spending too much. And that was it. We didn't tell them they were spending too much. We just made a Likert scale that made them end up on the end of it and made it red. And that was literally the whole treatment. The ones that were in the control, all we did was ask them what their expenditure pattern were for those 5 items. We didn't have a Likert scale, it was an open question, right? So that's it. We had a diary to back this up. Basically, the diary was a weekly income and expenditure diary that I built for a few other things in this Uganda project. It's built to be undertaken by people that are illiterate or even enumerate, using a tally basis and pictures of money in the top columns there. So this is a really powerful tool for very, very rural areas of Uganda. And we had that diary running before and after the treatment and control studies went out, which means we had essentially a DID approach. And then the endowment for all respondents participating in this was about 3 days base laboring wages. We also ran this without an endowment and found a very, very similar effect. So that's pretty big. And basically, large increase in savings for treated households. It was about 15%. That savings increase lasted for quite a while, which indicated that it was a substantial contribution to household funds, available funds. Big finding is that this is a nudge basis. It means that you don't need to create some crazy savings and loan system. This worked in the environment for the vast majority of people that were treated. So it's very cheap and easy to implement. And this is something we think we can incorporate into our program. So we run the supply chain out of Uganda with the idea that it's going to become a nationally owned program. And we are rapidly moving to an automated digital payment system. What I'd like to see is that we can present some nudges on the payment date that would basically induce increased savings. We'll have a whole range of other things too. We need to understand what savings tools can be used and are preferred. But there's a direct linkage to our supply chain program here of this research, right? So I think the key learning in this is when you can partner with some interventional psychologists. These Emily and Nicole are just flat out amazing. But the other thing here is that, again, you don't need to use a mathematical theory. You just need to be able to define the key decision problem and isolate that. And then you can run a field RCT. You can also see that RCTs don't need to be very large. This one is published in the best marketing and psychology journal in the world, and it was based on a very, very simple intervention. I'm not saying it was easy to publish, it was very difficult to publish, but it got in on a simple intervention. Right, so I guess we're at the stage where we can wrap up now. What other experiments have I done? I'll quickly go over them. We've done some lab and this is the one I worked on with Nicole, lab and field experiments on ambiguity aversion of information demand in Laos. So information demand is a pretty interesting thing. This one was fairly abstract, but there's no reason you couldn't transfer this to specific information contexts. You can also take that kind of experiment to studies on demand for money. So it's essentially the same design. We've done field experiments on labor payments to calibrate our quality conditional payment mechanism in Uganda. So that's basically going out, working with picking teams in Uganda and having different payment regimes. Some of them were just base pay, no quality conditional payment. Those didn't work very well. We had quality conditional payments where if they didn't pass a quality test, they got a very low payment or a base daily wage. And if they did, they got a really high daily wage. That worked really well. And this allowed us to calibrate what we needed to pay the pickers in order to get them to pick well. We also were able to estimate their time picking higher quality so that we can make sure that they're getting a net improvement in their welfare from income. And then a whole bunch of experiments on cognitive ability, which is basically my work in Bowden rationality theory. We've also, I didn't put it in here, I should have put it in here as an example, is we're just about to resubmit a paper on women's empowerment using a Becker de Groot Marshak experimental auction mechanism that allowed us to identify spouses' willingness to pay to hide income from their partner, and then to use the Becker de Groot Marshak mechanism to instrument the post-experiment expenditure patterns. So that came about because I had a really deep knowledge of experimental economics and was able to apply it to this setting of women's empowerment and hiding income. So it was actually rejected from Journal of Development Economics. We're probably going to resubmit to World Development next, but that's one I probably should have gone over as well. Forthcoming experiments, like I said, we have this digital payment program. We want to understand digital versus cash payments. So that's with my PhD student, Daniel Hill. I want to understand preference for payment format and savings options in that same thing. So I'm going to create new savings tools once we digitize it and test which ones work the best and which ones are in demand. So that could even include options to send money straight to schools to pay education costs, to the mortgage so you don't lose your house, or to set it up as a perpetuity, like a superannuation scheme, the premium on their coffee rewards, these kinds of things. So it's direct levers to our supply chain program there. And then I'm also putting in place some cognitive games that come out of my experimental work in order to instrument capacity of the manager in implementing natural capital investments on farms. So that's for a large national farm-based natural capital project I'm running. And this ADAPT thing here, this is the program we're building for the national program for Uganda. And the idea is hopefully if we can get some support, we'll bring that to Indonesia and set this up as a micro enterprise system to support coffee supply chains and basically set up as a nationally owned program for specialty coffee that's highly inclusive. Blah, blah, blah. It's all good stuff. Okay, so some ideas. We're here. This is a very short lecture. BRIN has just started up as this comprehensive research agency and is interested in experimental economics. So these are just my ideas. These are certainly not coming from BRIN at all. But maybe a pathway forward is we can start to work together to define your objectives around using experimental methods, start to understand the resources and capabilities that you have in-house now, and to identify what needs are required. Work towards a set of standard operating procedures so that instead of having to refer to this loosely set of slides here, instead there are clear outlines of what kind of experiments work where and how to progress through that design and implementation stage. And so that would then lead to training and experimental methods. Some ideas, as I've talked about a few times here, is the coffee value chains program. There is scope to link this into investments in sustainability, particularly in the highlands, and switching from horticultural production to coffee agroforestry. This would achieve multiple aims as well as potentially leverage emerging environmental investment markets. There's also scope to set up an online experimental lab system that would allow you to take tablets to the field and have a book of experimental methods ready to go, so that you'd be less reliant on in-house programming capabilities. But that's it. That's my email, phone number for WhatsApp if you'd like. And yeah, happy to take questions and have a chat. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. It's a great lecture today. I know that experimental economic is not familiar for many economists in Indonesia, because you know that that's not many they are involved in experimental. But anyway, yeah, you know, that's you stated that the experimental economics should be developed by theoretical solid theory or solid idea, like that, right? Okay, I invite everyone to ask to Dr. Gray. I have like some committee. Can you help us to show the question, or let me know if there's of us want to raise their hand and ask him to their Dr. Gray directly. One question is, we have compiled some question, Dr. Gray. One is from Sina Kintara. Is the research on supporting poor farmer in Rajasthan was the one of your research, or is there another research?
Yeah.
I read it all, and then you give feedback, right? It's okay.
All the questions, or just one at a time?
Oh, just two. Well, 2 questions and 3 questions, and after that you give your response.
Yep.
Right?
Sure.
And Muhammad Malik from BRIN, as you mentioned before about the Indian farmer. As I know, India now is successful farming in Asia too, and your research in Queensland is very interesting. Your opinion about the condition of Indonesian farm now during the topic, so how it's a concern to topic discussed today, economic in experimental economics techniques. Thank you. Yeah. Over to you, Dr.
Okay, thank you. So firstly, the research in Rajasthan was with Waikato University and ICRISAT. So Shalinda Kumar at ICRISAT is a colleague of mine that we've done some work together. We actually have a Journal of Development Studies paper just revise and resubmit now on a different topic. And then Professor Frank Scrimmager from Waikato University was my professor at the time. So that was the 3 of us on that work. So HERES has only been operating for about 1.5 years. So most of this work will be under various universities where I was at the time. All the future work will be under HERES, and some of the forthcoming work is under HERES as well. Question 2 is, in a way, India and Indonesia are facing similar concerns. So there are, in both cases, there's very substantial commercial development in agriculture, and in some cases, some really big wins in terms of productivity improvements. That is certainly not the case everywhere, particularly in India, which is facing some pretty severe environmental constraints. My view is that India, Indonesia, Uganda, Australia, the US, all of these places are facing really, really major issues around inclusivity in their policies. the policies, trade policies, agricultural support policies, exporting requirements, a whole bunch of these things, and environmental factors are only going to make this worse, are very much oriented towards helping large farmers do these things. So larger farmers, you can contract once and you get all your produce that is environmentally assured. You can buy, overseas buyer can contract with one farmer in Indonesia or Australia and get all of their produce. And so our current economic system is oriented around these really, really high transaction cost contracts that drive out competition from smallholders who are often some of the biggest innovators. And they're the ones that actually manage a lot of our more marginal lands as well, that are actually really important for public good aspects. So from my perspective, and what I'd like this coffee work in Uganda to start to become is a model for developing smallholder inclusive supply chains that generate high value for the countries that they're undertaken in, and high value for the producers, as well as generating really, really high quality produce out of those areas to Western countries that can support those kinds of values. This model, it will become a model, I hope, for understanding how to create policies that support low transaction costs and barriers to entry for smallholder producers. And so it's about re-leveling the playing field in competition to allow smallholder producers to aggregate their produce at a community level and to sell it in competition with large estate-based producers. My perspective, that's the most interesting problem to solve. If we can solve that, you actually solve a whole bunch of social welfare issues, particularly in middle-income countries such as Indonesia and India. So it's a really cool question. I think there are a lot of similarities, and there are some environmental constraints in India in particular. But let's focus on understanding inclusivity and how to generate that, because if we can do that, we get huge wins on both the agricultural productivity and profitability side and the welfare side. Yeah, cool.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Dr. BRIN. Then we still have like 30 minutes maybe. We still have unmade questions. The next question is from media. There are 4, 5, 6 questions. I think in the chat.
I can see that in the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, you can see it in the chat. Should I read it for you, or
I can just go through them if you'd like. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Lydia, thank you. So the first question, how did you go about creating the procedures of your experiment? Well, it depends. As I was pointing out, we want to start off with that real world tie and making sure that we've got, first of all, we're understanding what the decision problem we're trying to describe is. So we need to describe that. We want to build in a linkage straight away from that problem to policy or program levers. So things that we can change that will support the outcomes we're trying to achieve. So we really don't want to just be, because we're not focused purely on theory, we don't want to just describe a decision oddity. We want to go and say, well, we think this is happening in this decision problem, causing these outcomes when we want these other outcomes. So how do we flip the tracks to get to the ones that we're targeting? So once you've got that in place, you can then assess what economic tools will allow you to understand that decision problem and policy context. If it turns out experimental economics is the best one, you'll already have a pretty clear idea about the procedures you need to do because you'll have reviewed them. There's a whole bunch of work online that you can review. There's a Google groups around experimental methods that is really, really friendly, actually, and really worthwhile getting into. That's actually one thing about the experimental economists. They're actually a really friendly group of people. So don't feel afraid to get engaged with those groups. And so it really depends. You know, in the grazing experiment case, I already had a pretty clear idea about the dynamic decision problem I was facing. I knew that it was complex. I had to program it myself. I also knew I had to do it with the landholders because I needed that real world tie back to land condition. So that was pretty clear. In Rajasthan, I basically mapped the decision problem to that multi-attribute utility theory, and the multi-attribute utility theory literature was all using multiple price list methods in a efficient sense, but we wanted to use it in a cross-sectional sense, right? So it was obvious. Again, it came out. So you'll often find that it comes out of that review process. Talking to colleagues that are versed in experimental economics will help you understand what programs there are. And over time, you'll create this book of knowledge in your head that you can refer back to. So it just depends. But basically, having a strong idea of the problem to start with really helps. Choosing and gaining access to respondents. This is a classic question for any empirical research. It depends.
Yeah.
Depends.
Wait, I have like a follow-up question to the first one.
Yep.
So I have like so many things right now in my head. And if you have like, you think you have same problems for like that's like the previous question, Indonesia and India, would you like approach it in the similar way, or are you going to build another one for Indonesia and it's going to be different with India, or how would you do it?
So is this India and Indonesia, or is this more the supply chain innovations?
It's just like it's just analogy. Do you think if the objects are similar, are you going to do it the similar way?
My perspective is that context really matters most of the time. I don't like to develop theory or insights from an economic perspective without understanding the context of the problem. So I would not automatically translate an experiment in India to Indonesia or anywhere really. I think there are contextual elements that are usually extremely important. And understanding those will tell you whether you need to try and pull those out of the experiment, but this is the soft skills, is knowing how those, social institutions, for example, you'll need to know what you need to control to pull out. Sometimes they're really important and you want to actually have them in as a core variable in your model. So it's a good question. Context matters, and it's important to understand it before you do anything. Yeah. So choosing and gaining access to your respondents, it depends on the group. In the India case, we had Shailendra Kumar at ICRISAT. He had access to something like the Arid Lands Research Institute. I can't remember exactly what it's called. But basically, they had a book of people that they did extension programs with, and we were able to access those people. In Uganda, we had regional government permission and really good funding from an ACR-led project. And now that's flipped to our supply chain. We have our supply chain people. We would also be able to do a broader survey now if we had the resourcing to do it. So that one's relatively easy. Well, currently I'm doing these cognitive games for an extended theory of planned behavior that we've been developing, and it's an impact evaluation program for environmental investments. That one will be using substantial interest in participants participating in our program, and the EOIs will allow me to send them a survey. But I'll be setting that up as an automated online program, and there's actually huge interest from a whole range of government departments in using my impact evaluation method now, which means as soon as I set up as an online service system, they'll start accessing that on a pay-per-use approach. And it'll be like a public good pay-per-use. It won't be crazy extreme, but we still need to be able to calibrate that over time and have the resourcing to do that. So it differs. And it is, if you're understanding your decision problem, it's going to help you sell it to the people that are trying to pull the policy levers, and hopefully you can get some resourcing as well as some contact lists from that. So yeah, it's a core problem of any empirical research, not just experimental methods. And then if you have a lab, okay, well then you usually have a participant list, but you can still run into problems, as I was suggesting. Online labs are different. You can access through mTurk on Amazon very, very cheap workers that fill out your experiments for you. There's online survey panels in Australia that I'll start to link up with using our experimental methods. They usually do just normal surveys, and we use them for that. But I will be setting up meetings with them to try and serve experiments to them and their groups as well, because that's real people, kind of. Much more real than most online experiments access in any case. So yeah, it depends. So your options. Yes. Okay. Did I study these fields deeply myself? Yes, I did. Now, not everyone can do that. I understand that. I had time to do it. I have a slight element of craziness and masochism here. So I spend far too much time reading and going deeply into these things and keep on studying. You can do it. I wouldn't suggest most people do it. I would focus on 1 or 2 core skills, but the more you can understand decision making and the concepts underpinning that, the better off you'll be. I see the methods we use as the hammers. Those are relatively easy to learn in most cases. Experimental economics, not so much, and survey methods also not so much. There's so many soft skills involved in those. But most of the methods, all the econometric methods, they're just tools. Don't get stuck on one of them. Understand what's available and learn it when you need to learn it in detail. But otherwise, understand the conceptual underpinnings of your problem is the most important thing, from my view. Okay, impacts created by Heuris. That's a good question. We are young, but firstly, we have our own supply chain running coffee, right? We have 2 cafes now in Adelaide. That is the market for that coffee. That coffee is generating about a 40% improvement in value for the households we're targeting. It's about a 200% 150% improvement for the country as a whole for the amount that's, you know, per unit. And there's 40% women by volume in our program. So we've got a very, very clear focus on inclusivity and value for those producers. And we've built the model. That's a whole different talk, actually, but because it's a whole model around sustainable, inclusive, and scalable high value coffee supply chains. And it's not just coffee. Coffee is the low hanging fruit for us. So that's our biggest impact yet. We are hoping to bring that into Indonesia. We'd love to partner with your organization on how to do that and the learnings that would be different between Indonesia and Uganda. We're also working with the lead economists on a national natural capital on farms project. So we're leading the behavioral change components and the economic analysis and benchmarking of how natural capital can support production outcomes. We are doing, I call it low bono work. So, you know, pro bono is for free. Well, it's not free, but it's very much below our cost. And it's work to try and reframe development in Northern Australia to be more sustainable and inclusive of Indigenous people. That's supported by the Pew Charitable Trust, and that's very likely to have some pretty big policy impacts because we have Pew on board and it's very hard-hitting work. And before that, we actually did some work on a crazy irrigation approval that the Northern Territory government did and just kind of nailed it. and that's all in the media as well. So in the short 1.5 years time, we've had some pretty big impacts. Oh, we also wrote food systems resilience work for the OECD that ended up being a single authorship report when it was meant to be a joint author. So we're still new, but we're having some pretty big impacts. And we're aiming to keep on going. We're actually going to change. We're going to try and do an experiment in wine supply chains to provide access to market. And we're also going to try and do some work with disability inclusion on the coffee side here on the retail. So you have full from Uganda, ethical, and then you have all the way here. And our retail side is also good, including people who otherwise don't have very good prospects for work. So yeah, everything we try and do has kind of a theoretical, interesting aspect to it, but we have very strongly focused on having an impact on each thing we do as well. So that's kind of answers, has it translated to policy? Let's say that it's in process. And yes, you should explore software programming. It's an extremely useful skill. And if you learn one software, it's not very hard to learn the other ones. So I started with R. I self-taught myself before it was popular in economics. Moved to Python, Django, which is the HTML linkage for Python. Did some Android programming for some of these experiments actually, and then moved to web dev JavaScript last year. So once you learn one, it's a steep and slippery slope and you'll start learning all the other ones. Thanks, Nidia.
Thank you so much for and I hope I can adopt your masochism there.
Good plan.
Thank you.
Andrian?
Before that, I read the chat room. I would like to invite the attendees, Laura, wants to asking directly to Dr. Greg? No? Raise your hand.
Yeah.
No? Yeah, okay. We can continue to the next question. Is
Andrian, I think.
Andrian, right? Could you ask more regarding the boundary rationality, particular difference between the two concepts and the consequences, decision making? I think that's regarding the. I'm gonna add the question is you add like decision making theory and game theory as well, right? And
yeah,
you put in behavior economics, right, out there. And I think that's related to this question is regarding the bounded rationality, and the bounded rationality is part of the behavior economics theory, if I'm not mistaken, right? Because there's, yeah, I know that the experimental economics is not easy because you join too many theory between the classical and non-classical economics, and now there's new things that is game theory, behavior economics, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yep, that's
yeah.
So it feels like Andrian has been sneaking into my hard drive on this one. Actually, I'm sure he hasn't, because this is actually the question links to some work that I've been working on for several years, piecemeal, because I haven't had the time, on what I'm calling optimal heuristics. And the idea of optimal heuristics is that the space of rationality. So if we think of a graph with a space where rationality exists on a value and effort axes, my hypothesis is that that space is actually vanishingly small and actually doesn't exist in the real world. So on one side of that space is very, very simple heuristics, like the Kahneman and Tversky type of heuristics. What type of salt should I choose? I'm just going to go with the salt I always choose, or the salt brand I saw on the advert outside the store. You know, really simple problems that really, really don't matter. You don't want to spend too much time thinking about them. On the other side of this infinitely small divide of rationality are the complex problems that are actually infeasible to solve. And this is the real space of bounded rationality. And so that work, what I'm trying to do with that work is, first of all, define decision technologies. So that moving into my production theory side of thing, bringing production theory into decision theory and saying the way that we look at decision making in economics is that the technology for decision making, expected utility theory, is the same as the welfare function for decision making, which is crazy. They're different things. How we make a decision is a technology that leads to welfare, so distributional welfares, depending on what happens. But the idea of this, which is what I think you're getting at in a way, is by defining those decision technologies, we actually can start a new stream of research on which ones are the best and when do they apply. And we can move away from assuming that everyone's rational and go, okay, well, they're not rational, but there are times when these kinds of heuristics work really well. What are they? What is their format? And how do we calibrate them to different contexts? And so understanding where the limits to the bounds on rationality, which I think are vanishingly small, will put us into that next stage of research on the technologies of decision making. And it will give economists a place at the table around how to do better operations research, for example. So cool question. It is research that I'd love to get back into full time once I have time. I'm happy to share more. I hope that answers that in a way.
Thank you. That's great. And then we can move to next question from Leslie Ligman from BRIN. What is difficult problem which can experimental methods, and what aspect do we have to consider to apply amount of monetary reward in making choices?
Yep. I think the first part of this question, which typical problems, is any decision problem that you can boil down to some simple interventions or changes. So if you can, if there's a problem in the real world, savings is a classic example, right? Well, almost everyone is a bad saver in a way, one way or another, or they eat too much cake, or some kind of salience decision problem. You can boil that decision problem down to its constituents in different contexts. So if it's cake, you can present people with cake versus an apple. If it's savings, you can offer them delayed time payments. There's all kinds of things. But the key thing is that you're taking that real world broad decision problem, you're thinking of the context that you care about it in, and you're boiling it down to its constituent elements. And you're using those elements to vary the decision problem in a way that's nicely controlled. That applies whether it's in the lab or an RCT. And so that's basically it. If we're thinking of these kinds of things, it's when we can boil down the decision problem, even if it's a social decision problem like a market, to one or two or three core things that are driving it, and be able to isolate those core things and test them independently as well as jointly. And that's it. So even context, household bargaining or hiding income, for example, the context is the critical factor there. But what we need to do is be able to isolate the man and the woman, or the partners in the relationship, so that we can allow them to hide the income. And then, do they hide the income, and are they willing to pay for it? We've boiled it down to a control problem and an observability problem. And that's it, is basically, if you can boil down the problem to a few little things that you can control, you can set this up as an experiment. And that's when experiments in economics are pretty powerful. And applying monetary rewards, it depends. I'd say in rural areas of developing countries, you probably need to be using 2 to 3 days wages minimum. In Australia with students, I aim for about 150% of the hourly wage on average, depending on performance. For farmers, like I said, I use $250 and I spend about 2 hours with them. So you actually got to take a stab and give it a try and see if it's working. You do start to get a feel for what payment will work. And the literature will help too. Now, if everyone in the literature is paying 3 times more than you did for a similar experiment in a similar context, you can't expect to get published, because they won't think that it's a valid incentive. The other way doesn't work so much. If everyone's paying like 10 cents and you're paying $10, well, that's a powerful experiment. So yeah, don't be substantially less than everyone else. And if you're substantially more, you're probably spending too much money.
So you should set up the games, right? Regarding their incentive, join or not join with your experimental. And the next question is from Public Policy BRIN. Based your experience, how deal with the compounding after you got a result from RCT? The fact is, when compounding is highly correlated with growth, predictive, and control. Thank you.
Yeah, so this question, I think, is dealing with RCTs that are probably more complex than what they're really designed for. So we've got to remember that RCTs came out of essentially the agricultural and health literature, and they're generally single hit with very, very low cross-pollination, you might say, between. So you can set up fields where they are clearly independent from the field next to them. And it's relatively easy to do. Same with medical trials, that one person takes one kind of pill and the other person takes a different, you're not going to get cross effects across them. In economics and social settings, cross effects are big. And if there's an ongoing policy program, you can get neighborhood effects, you can get all kinds of things. And so it just depends on the RCT. If there's a way you can boil down the RCT, so in our household bargaining experiments, for example, in our savings experiment, we're able to boil that down to a really simple one-hit thing that was largely independent. In many cases with policy, it's very difficult to make those independent so that you have a clear treated and control group, in which case you need to start thinking about econometric methods to account for the accidental spread of the policy and for mismatching between control and treatment groups. So there's a whole bunch of work on that. There's a whole range of different approaches, whether you're doing DID on a boundary level, or all kinds of stuff. It really depends on the problem. and it can be a very hard problem to solve.
The next question is from YouTube BRIN. So I'm sorry if my question a little bit out of topic. You don't have to say sorry. Yeah, I have a question. I have an experience. I conducted a natural experiment by utilizing an occurrence of land expropriation as the treatment assignment, but my supervisor see this as a quasi-experiment.
Yeah.
What's the main difference between the two kind of experiment in your opinion?
There we go. Okay, so my perspective was that these are essentially the same thing. Right, a natural experiment is a quasi-experiment because it wasn't actually set up as an experiment, it just happened. I did a quick Google right then, and it says here, some authors distinguish between a natural experiment and a quasi-experiment, the difference being that in a quasi-experiment, the criterion for assignment, so who gets treated and is selected by the researcher. So I think by the sounds of things, you have a natural experiment here, not a quasi-experiment, because you didn't select the people who got assigned treatment versus not treatment. But yeah, my original perspective was that they are essentially the same thing. There's apparently some finer level differentiation in the literature on that. But maybe you just Google that and show your supervisor that rather than say that Daniel said it so that we can remain friends. Okay, I think that's all the questions. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Yuda, I invite you if you're not clear or if you have any feedback for Dr. Greg.
It's crystal, your answer. But however, my supervisor still insists that the occurrence of the land expropriation that I take is quasi-experiment, not a natural experiment. At the first, I proposed this is the natural experiment, but my supervisor didn't agree. Yes, I still have unclear the differentiation between these two kinds of experiment. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks. Okay, I'm just going to highlight, I probably need to get going in about 7 minutes. I've got another meeting quite soon.
Okay. What time? Sorry, Dr. Greg.
I've got another meeting coming up in about 7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay.
Yeah.
For the next question is, no, I think we don't have any question.
I think that's mostly it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I invite you guys, our floor, if you want to ask directly to Dr. Greg. We still have 7 minutes before he'll leave us. No? No? Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Greg, for your time, for the very exciting second lecture series. And I'm so sorry that my computer has a problem in here, but let me say thank you to the floor and audience. Thank you also for Dr. Greg for your time and explaining about the experimental economics. I know that experimental economics is not such like easy economics because you know there are so many items in economics theory regarding the behavior and so on and so forth that should be involved in the should be considered in experimental economics. So thank you everyone for joining with the second lecture series. I hope that you can join with us for the next lecture series. I hand it over to Master of Ceremony, to Ibu Apri. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pak Felix. It's very wonderful and insightful lecture. For the appreciation of your valuable sharing and recent insight, we would like to present a certificate for Dr. Daniel Black. And give some applause for him. Not showing yet. Just wait a moment. Yeah.
Thank
Once
you.
again, thank you very much, Dr. Daniel Greg, for your lecture. Distinguished participants. Maybe before you leave, we can take a picture first, Daniel. And please open the camera, all of the participants. Give your big smile. The first slide, please.
All right.
Second, it's already committed, already screened.
Second slide.
Okay, let me count. 3, 2, 1, go.
Okay. Once more, next slide. 3, 2, 1. Ready? Next.
Yes, thank you.
Finish. Okay, I think it's already finished. Thank you very much, Daniel, for once again. And distinguished participant, Dr. Gede Mahatma Yuda Bakti, the research coordinator of behavioral economics, will close this lecture. Please.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Kita semua, Indonesia di mana, Official Center of the Overall Circle and Circular Economy, Ibu Ubi Haruman yang di and so to this lecture, Dr. Daniel Beck, ladies and gentlemen, now finally the second lecture series are going to finish. For your information, the second series is one of the program organized by the Research Center for Behavioral and Circular Economy. The aim is to develop capacity of our research and audience. Today, in this second lecture series, we learn about experimental for economic studies. Although this event is only taking for 2 hours, I just hope this event is useful for us to do research work, and at this moment, I want to say thank you very much to guys lecture, Dr. Daniel Greg. Thanks a lot for your sharing, for your knowledge for experimental economy, and many thanks to the committee for making this event a success. Thank you to our participants who attend, who participate and discuss and the series as your information. The total participant today are almost 200 people in Zoom and YouTube streaming. Hopefully, this series can be a trigger for all of us to collaborate in the next activities. Thank you for joining us here and the second lecture series. See you in the next lecture series and next event. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Distinguished participants, we finally come to the end of today's agenda. Let us close the lecture series by reciting adalah. Those are all the agendas we have presented to you all this morning. We hope you learned something. Thank you so much for your attention. See you next occasion. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam. Thank you for all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pak Daniel.
Thank you.
so
Bye-bye.
much, Mbak Cantik.
Pak Daniel.